내요 미야 조회야다 조간 내요 미야 조회야다 조간 내요 미야 조회야다 후야미야나 에만나 마마네요 도야 조회야다 조간 내요 미야 조회야다 조간 내요 미야 조회야다.
The voice and the tone, like the tone of the piece is very, it's in a very strange space. It's not really in like the mode of like the, you know, like the traditional, like the ancient type story, but it also is not really in like the entirely contemporary, I guess, voice of realism either. It's in a sort of in between space, and you have that sort of that tone you're working with, but then there's also like actual just Northern California history in there, and I thought that was really interesting. And I'm just wondering like how you found the voice for the book, and how you went about like getting all of that to fit with that voice, because I thought that was unusual.
You know, I wrote originally. You know, you get older, and I did Grand Avenue, Watermelon Nights, and a lot of the, as you were saying, socially real stuff, and which covers and explores a lot of our traumatic history, the history of colonization of our peoples here in California. And I did a lot of that. But as you get older, and having been a tribal leader for so long, you want something that's, you know, we know about that, and I want to do something a little different. One of the things I started doing for my tribe in our monthly newsletters is I thought, well, I'm going to write some of the stories from our traditional storytelling cycles that we used to tell stories in the winter. And so I wrote How a Mountain Was Made. And it's basically a storytelling cycle with the Crow sisters telling the stories. In the old days, folks, people would tell stories in the winter, and the storyteller would sit in the dark and imitate the voices of the various animals in the stories. And of course, that's great for the imagination, whether you're young or old, because you picture, it's like reading, it's the best of reading or watching. So I had heard a lot about that. So I thought, well, I'm gonna start writing some of the stories that I remember having heard when I was younger in a cycle. And I had the Crow sisters there talking and telling the stories. So each month, and I gave myself a month to publish 16 of those stories. So they went in the newsletter, and the old people really said, oh my gosh, this is just like what we used to hear when we were kids, these stories. So that was sort of the genesis of that form. But then I thought, okay, well, those stories took place in an ancient time when the animals were still people. We have the inverse, you know, the Judeo-Christian thing is the hierarchy where you have man on top and woman under and all that sort of thing. Well, for us, the upshot of the stories are we were all people until one of them got greedy and bad and caused trouble, and the animals grew wings and legs and ran away, and the humans were left the dumbest, having to continue to reconnect and try to reconnect with what they fell out from and the lessons they forgot. So I thought, okay, well, I want to write something about what happened to us after we became human and left the mountain, and we forgot a lot of those old stories. So I created contemporary and, you know, well, historical. Some go back to the 19th century. The last story is set in the future. And so I thought, well, I'll create stories that are about real people who behave in ways that they need to learn something or remember those things that are so important for life to go on. Themes, central themes, that we are not the center of the universe, that some of our best intentions have the worst outcomes, that we have to remember, again, that we are a part of something and not the center of something. And again, just basic things like being sensitive to other people or to the landscape, and remembering that animals and whatever we do to them have power, and those things can come back on us. So I created stories that have, I hate the term magical realism, because for us Indian people, there isn't anything magically real. It always is what it is. As Mabel McKay always used to say to me, ain't no such thing as imagination. it's all real in many ways. So I created these stories in time, in place, Sterling, so that that they were fun. Adults can read them, young people can read them and get what's going on. I think it just sort of evolved that way. And I wasn't kidding on the car way over here. Part of it is I sort of fell in love and thought I'd do something nice. You know, you can do that when you fall in love. So I thought, okay, well, I'll start writing. You know, these are wonderful stories about the possibility of learning and goodness and what we need to have a future and what's so necessary for a sustainable future for my tribal people and for all people. And it's mixed. I mean, the people, the forgetters, are of all races and everything. So
This is something that I talked about with my students in my native creative writing class a lot last quarter, and I think it's something that every Indian writer has to think about. But I'm curious, like what your thought process was in going about, like saying you're going to take elements of traditional stories and use them in a fictional work that I think is maybe a little more fraught than people might imagine. In term, I think there are pitfalls there that you have to figure out how to avoid, and I'm wondering like how you went about figuring out how to do that so that it didn't feel like you were just sort of
appropriating.
Yeah, like you can't like appropriating your own call. You know what I mean? Like taking your own and kind of, what I mean.
I've suffered both ways, because when I was doing, as you say, the socially real stories at Grand Avenue and Watermelon Nights, of course, until the movie came out, only one person had read the book, and then the rumors flew, and everybody was going to sue me. All my cousins were going to sue me because I was writing about them. And then once they saw the movie, they go, oh, it's about us, it's not literally us. So I was safe. All right, and then they, of course, wanted to be in the movie. And my aunts, became famous and went around town wearing sunglasses and things. But with these stories, with a lot of the traditional stories that you're asking me about now, people will come up to me and say, that's not really how it happened. Those aren't real. You're making up a lot of stuff. And I'm going, okay, well, what are you referring to? And they're referring to anthropological texts. And I said, look what Grandpa Tom said when he was talking to the anthropologist. And I said, yes, and Grandpa Tom was lying for 25 cents a day so he could have a nice suit to be buried in. That's what he was telling. And so, these stories were never set. And by the way, we have to get past that idea of culture being something that's static. It's something dynamic, the borders of which are porous. Things come in and out. We're in contact. By the way, we're transcribing an oral text anyway, and it's going to be different right off the start. So this, if it's good and it's going to help us in the time, our ceremonies were always changing, adapting to what we needed. They weren't fixed. And again, some of my people, have fallen prey to the idea that something they read that somebody said in a text was as it really was, when in fact, it was greatly edited by the indigenous teller to begin with. And by the way, they were always changing, and the stories were always changing in many ways. So I felt that this was the right way and a useful way to kind of bring in the old ethics and aesthetics of place that enabled us a healthy relationship with one another in the land for thousands of years. And so this has actually been easier because they don't quite see themselves in some of these, characters as they did in Grand Avenue. So, so it's been a little easier this time around. But so far, so good. They're enjoying them. And, of course, they still come up to me and go, I know who that is in the story, and I go, no, you don't. And and, of course, with Grand Avenue, they're all saying, because there was a teacher there, they're all saying, you were the teacher. And I said, no, I was the wild daughter that was having sex all over the neighborhood. That they had to think for a while on that one.
Well, that's better than, like, when I published my first story, I got one cousin that liked it and one cousin that hated it and said, "Who does he think he is, a ladies' man?" And I was like, "That's like never underestimate your relatives' inability, unfamiliarity with the art of fiction." to like,
Did you have any that wanted to sue you? That's the thing.
Well, I haven't written that one yet.
Yes. So, of course, I told them if they all, but there was about 10 of them that thought they were the same person. They're going to have to sue each other ultimately. But, you read it and they don't understand what we do in fiction, that it is about us and not literally us. And, so it's part of working with your people. And ultimately then they're proud and, happy, and for the most part. I mean, Sterling, as it was mentioned, they keep electing me as chairman. So, I mean, I think I'm like a record 32 years.
There's no one, I'm certain that no one has ever served as tribal chairman as long as you have in the history of the country. But that's not, like, that just means there's something wrong with Greg, though. Because,
truly. That's the first true thing you've said all night.
Because
Yes.
no one in their right mind even wants to be tribal chairman twice. But Greg has done it for 16 terms.
This mind is far from right and very left. So maybe that helped. I don't know. But no, I don't know where the time went. But it takes a toll. And if you have the opportunity to do a good thing, sometimes I think Mabel McKay, the medicine woman, fixed me. When I was young and 19, very troubled, she gave me a basket and she said, "You're going to be a leader among the people one day, and this basket is going to protect you." And I thought to myself, "Oh yeah, lady, and the sun's going to come up in the west." So I think she actually hexed me or something. I don't know.
I have one question for you before we send you up to read some of your book.
Send me to my room?
Yes. Think about what you've done. Okay. So I wanted to ask you about the endings of the stories. I found, the way that we're talking about these stories are actually much more complex than the way we're able to discuss them here. And I was actually really interested in the endings because the endings, I found the endings very unexpected, and I felt like almost every single ending, I think that every ending of every story in some way was a surprise to me, which is, I think, the moment when those stories really become like they really exit the world of traditional stories and become something entirely different. And I'm wondering, like, how, because every story I was like, I have no idea how we got to this ending, but this is the right ending. And so I'm wondering how you. It felt like endings in some way were on your mind, or you found like the right way to do these to finish these stories. And I'm curious, were you just finding the endings as you were, like, how were you thinking about it?
I had an idea, but you know what I was trying to do? I was trying to play with the reader so that the reader, like the characters, thought they were smart and knew where this was going. And I was tricking them to the end so that they become like the character in the story. Oh, I didn't know all I thought I knew. And yet it was all there right in front of you. Mm-hmm. So thank you, because that's exactly what I was trying to do. Give the reader that experience of, wow, it was there all along and I didn't see it, I didn't get it. Just like many of the characters, the protagonists in the stories. So that was true. And I don't know about my influence. Recently I got a note from somebody that said these stories work kind of like Flannery O'Connor's. They're kind of strange, and then at the end there's this weird twist. Of course, I don't murder everybody the way she does, but at the end, she, like in A Good Man Is Hard to Find, the grandmother gets shot between the eyes, and the misfit says she would have been a good woman if there'd been someone to shoot her every day of her life. And actually, as weird and bizarre as that is, when you've read the story, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But, you didn't think you were going to go there. And who would murder a nice grandmother who turns out to have not been so nice? But anyway, so that was sort of in my mind, Sterling. I didn't think so much of Flannery O'Connor, but I certainly liked her work, and I liked the element of surprise in a story. But I would often get to the end, and the ends just happen, and then others. The one that you liked about the sturgeon, that was hard. I went back and forth about how to land that one. And, the end, the landing only works. The story doesn't work if the ending doesn't work. So,
that ending is beautiful. And I of course can't remember the title of the story, but I can't remember the title of anything. So that's not but I found the ending of that one in particular really moving. We're going to have you read for a few minutes now.
So what I'm going to do is just read kind of the opening so you'll get a sense of who the Crow sisters, the storytellers are, and then I'll just read the short story, which is the first story, which is a shorter one. So let's see. Coyote's let's start with, and all of the stories take place in the course of a day as they're sitting on the fence. So we start with Good Morning. Coyote's twin granddaughters, Answer Woman and Question Woman, landed on a fence rail high atop Sonoma Mountain to chatter the day away and tell stories, as they have on so many days. Sonoma Mountain has always been a special place for Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo people. It is said that Coyote was sitting atop Sonoma Mountain when he decided to create the world and people, but that is just one story. There are many stories, as the mountain itself has so many things, rocks and animals, birds and grasses, fish, frogs, springs and creeks, trees, and each thing has a story. Some of the stories take place in a sacred time before this time, when the birds and animals were all people living on the mountain. But regardless of the time, the stories connect with one another, just as the animals and plants and all other things on Sonoma Mountain do. That is one of the many important lessons the stories teach, that since the beginning of time, all of life is one story, one family. The best way to hear the stories is to listen to Answer Woman and Question Woman. You can find them sitting up the mountain near the place folks call Gravity Hill. Some people will tell you they are a pair of crows. Others will say the twin sisters are human, claiming to have seen two identical-looking women with long dark hair leaning against the same fence rail, talking. In any event, this is their predicament. Answer Woman can tell all the stories, but she cannot think of them unless she is asked. Question Woman, on the other hand, cannot remember a single answer, not one story, and she must always ask her questions in order to hear the answer again. One day it was early, the sun a mere line of light above the mountain's peak. The sisters were already squawking, bickering, which wasn't unusual, although this was especially early in the day for it. I don't like the stories you've been telling, said Question Woman. Can't you even say good morning, quipped her sister. Okay, good morning. So what's the problem, Sister Question Woman? You're not telling creation stories, the stories from that time before this time when all the animals and birds were still people. Well, there are other stories that must be told, the forgetter stories. Part 1. The sisters sat a long while. Birds sang. The sky was clear. In the valley below the mountain, thick fog had rolled back to the ocean. Question Woman, looking about, was unhappy. You keep telling stories about the forgetters, she complained. They are the people who left this mountain long ago, and when they came back to this land, they'd forgotten all the important stories. They didn't even remember that they came from the mountain. But sister, nothing has changed, answered Answer Woman. How can you say that? The forgetters are foolish. They go about hurting one another. They hurt the animals and plants. They forgot that we are one family. They forgot that this world is our home. Even the Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo people who settled closest to this mountain after creation, even many of them have forgotten, which is why I tell stories about the forgetters. So we, all of us, remember. Those ancient people who lived at the time Coyote created Earth and the people they forgot, they too often acted foolish. That is what I mean by nothing has changed. We need stories to remember, just as the ancient ones did. The people today spread out in the towns and valleys. We are one family. These stories, like the old stories, mark the land so that we can know the stories and find ourselves. Just as an outcropping of rocks on the mountain reminds us of a story, so can a patch of clover alongside a freeway, or even an old house in Santa Rosa. We share the same sky, the same sun and moon. All right, you made your point. I guess I'd forgotten. It's your nature, sister. Now, don't make fun of me. The sisters were quiet then. The morning grew warm. A cool breeze blew from the ocean that could be seen in the distance. 2 clouds like doors appeared on the horizon. Didn't I ask you about those clouds? Question woman asked her sister. Yes, and I was reminded of a story. It's about a boy from Bodega Bay who opened the clouds. Will you listen now? Question woman, looking embarrassed, nodded. Okay, well then listen. A boy opens the clouds. This happened at Calcutki, which was a village near the ocean just north of Salmon Creek. Many people were living there after the white people came, and there weren't many places for Indians to live, only steep and barren hillsides or rocky plateaus above the sea, like Calcutki. Many of the people had come from the missions or from former nations and villages where it was warmer. They had gathered there sometime in the late 1860s when there was work for them on nearby ranches and farms. The cold, salty air caused them to shiver night and day. You can't build a fire big enough to keep us warm, they complained to the few native coastal villagers. But even these villagers suffered the cold at Calcutki, and they acknowledged how difficult it could be. Before the white people arrived, their villages were strategically located to protect them from the wind and cold fog. Now Calcutki, in the past no more than a summer camp, was the only plot of land a white man didn't want to own. Nothing would grow there, and the sea cliff was steep, making it difficult for the villagers to reach the only strip of beach where they were free to dig clams and pick seaweed. They worked long hours for the white man. How else could they live? What is this place? People asked themselves. Where are we? There was one small boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, who, they say, had been a rascal in the cradle on his mother's back. He'd cry and screech loud enough to scare the salmon from the banks where people fished. Once, as a baby, while his mother was gathering blackberries in the hills above the bay, he drew the attention of a bear, one of the last grizzlies people remembered. She'd hung his cradle on a branch not 5 feet from where she was filling her basket with ripe fruit, and he wailed so loud it is said his cries echoed in the hills. Some villagers speculated that the grizzly wasn't a bear at all, but a human, as the animal did nothing but stand on its hind feet and walk away just like that, standing upright. Those Indians from the missions argued that those old-time things didn't happen anymore. The people no longer turned themselves into bears. Whatever the case, the woman placed her cradle on her back and hurried off, leaving her basket of berries on the ground as an offering should the bear return. One day, when the boy was only 4, he said to his mother, "Why did you leave me hanging on a branch where a bear could have eaten me?" "I was right there where I could see you," she answered. "You cried so loud the bear heard you." Perplexed by the boy's unusual memory, his mother sought the advice of an old Indian doctor who provided no advice but to watch the boy, saying that he had eyes that could see things other people couldn't see, which is why, not a year later, when he began gazing at the ocean with unbroken focus, hardly ever moving or responding to anyone's words, they let him sit all day long, right there on the same rock. He didn't have to husk acorns or haul water, chores expected of other children. The villagers remembered what the old Indian doctor told his mother. He could see things. Some people said he was a lazy boy, spoiled, and that he saw nothing, that he'd only fooled his mothers and others to get out of work. On long, cold nights and on days when the damp coastal fog hid the hills and trees, when the villagers could hardly see a foot in front of them, they continued to speculate about the boy. One woman, a friend of the boy's mother, who'd been the mistress of a white fisherman from Bodega Bay, thought that the boy could see whales far out at sea, even through the dense fog. Another woman suggested he might be able to see when sea bass approach the waters where we fish on the beach that isn't owned by a rancher or the mill boss. The doubters from the missions agreed with the villagers who thought the boy was lazy, if not also clever, because he got his mother and others to believe he had a special power. After all, the boy, when asked what he saw, never answered. When people inquired of the old Indian doctor, he too would give no answer. He told them that he was not from this place, reminding them that he, like so many others, had been taken into a mission as a young boy, and now even further from his home in San Jose, he doubted in his great age he would have the chance to find his way back. Fog settled over the land, so thick people could no longer tell day from night. People could not travel about. The villagers huddled near fires, burned driftwood to keep warm. Those men working for the ranchers and the women who washed clothes and kept houses could not see their way back to Calhoun. They huddled at night in horse stalls to keep warm. Then the fog lifted, and where the boy was looking, there were two clouds like doors in the blue horizon. Someone remembered then that it was said the wind came from two doors in the sky. Still, the boy said nothing. But not long after, he began huffing and puffing, blowing his breath toward the clouds. And what a breath he had. His crying as a baby opened his lungs, his mother said. It was as if he was practicing getting stronger and stronger until one cloud seemed to roll open in the sky, and the wind blew over the water to the village. The cloud looked as if it was slightly ajar, and the wind blew to the south. When the second cloud door opened, again slightly ajar, the wind blew north. When both clouds opened toward the village, the wind blew directly onto the land, east. And when they opened in the opposite direction, the wind came back, west over the hills, as if it were returning to the far sea from whence it came. The boy, huffing and puffing, blew and blew day and night. No one doubted any more what the boy had been seeing through the fog. He had seen the cloud doors from where the wind comes. Days and nights passed, and the boy didn't stop. The sky cleared. It was so clear that the villagers could see for miles up and down the coast. They saw whales spouting far out at sea. East in the hills, they saw the great tall redwoods the mill workers hadn't found. And when more and more people came to see the boy working his magic to open and close the doors, the villagers saw how many big and beautiful rocks covered the hillside above the village, for that is where the spectators gathered, sitting on the rocks to have a perfect view of the clouds opening and closing with the shifting winds. For the most part, the villagers were happy. They could see their way down the steep cliff to dig clams and pick seaweed. Calhoun became famous. Indians far and near journeyed to the village to see the boy who could open the clouds. The visitors brought food and offerings of clothes and blankets for the villagers. They told stories, and everyone seemed to remember that they had known about the cloud doors, or at least having been told about them. At last we know where to see the clouds, where the wind comes from, the visitors said. The few villagers with ancestral ties to the coast were equally surprised. How come we didn't know before that the clouds could be seen in plain sight right where we lived, they wondered. But before long, people began to miss the fog. While the sun shone brightly, the wind was still very cold, more biting than the fog. People noticed how dry everything had become. Dust blew up constantly, and it was impossible to keep a good fire, for smoke blew every which way as the villagers and their guests huddled to keep warm. Maybe just once a week. Do it on Sundays when the ranchers and mill bosses give us time off. Open the clouds then. Just on Sundays, the boy's mother pleaded with her son. But he would not listen. He laughed in his mother's face, then only huffed and puffed harder. A villager, a young man, insulted by the boy's disrespect for his mother, told her she should have let the bear eat him. He's a demon, the young man said. Others weren't so harsh, but everyone agreed the boy should stop his antics. The ranchers had been concerned for a long while about the wind. Dust blinded their cattle and horses. Wind whipped the pears and apples from their trees. Of course, they would never have believed what was happening at Calhoun. What concerned them was that so many Indians gathered in one place. Their Indian herders and housekeepers had been careful to complete their chores before escaping quietly to the village. But now so many Indians gathered at Calhoun that the sky was bright at night with firelight. When the ranchers came around armed with guns, suspecting an Indian uprising, everything changed. If you are not planning an uprising, then you are surely going to set the land on fire with all of this wind, the ranchers said before leaving on their horses. The villagers were frightened that the ranchers would return and force them to leave the only place they could still call home. They discouraged villagers who nonetheless continued to gather on the hillside to witness the clouds opening and closing, many of them first-time visitors, as word of the boy's power continued to travel. The boy must be stopped altogether, the village leader said, but the poor mother could not stop her errant son. Even the old Indian doctor from San Jose could find no herbs to put the boy in order. All I can do, he told the mother, is put him to sleep for a while. I have a song for that. Maybe you can do something with him then. The Indian doctor taught her the song. He told her not only must she sing the song one time, but she must remember it for later. That night, alone with her son, the woman sang the old man's song, and indeed the boy fell asleep right there on the rock where he'd been huffing and puffing, and the wind stopped. But the mother was not at peace. She knew the boy would wake with the first light of day. She knew he would immediately begin opening and closing the clouds again, and that she could not possibly continue singing forever. She would have to take the boy where he could not see the clouds. And before morning she left, packing the now large child on her back, to a camp deep in a hollow near Freestone, where her sister lived. And there, it is said, she stayed, and she remembered the old Indian doctor's advice, for whenever the boy threatened to run away, most likely to the ocean, she knew how to put him to sleep. The fog returned, but not as it had after the boy started his show of power. Many people claimed the boy had made the fog so dense and long-lasting, only so that he could have fun causing so much trouble. Soon there wasn't a visitor left on the rocks above the village, and the day would come when even the last of the villagers were gone, scattered to find other places to live after a rancher bought the last of the land there. But to this day, the old-timers passing now on Highway 1 might see the rocks situated like people on the hillside, or they might even see two clouds on the horizon and remember that they are passing Calhootki, now in Story's a great village. Some claim to have seen the clouds open and close, but no one tries to huff and puff at the clouds. Let the wind be, they say. Whatever happened to the boy is anyone's guess. He must have learned not to tamper with the wind, for if, as a man, he came to the ocean and remembered what he had done, he never talked about it, but instead went about his business and listened as people told stories about a boy who opened the clouds. Yeah.
These are really strange stories to me, and to me that's a very high compliment. I really there's something very strange about Flannery O'Connor's stories to me, and I felt like these are strange stories in ways that were totally unexpected to me. I don't know. I just wanted to say that because it was one of the dominant parts of my experience of going through the book. I want to go back to Grand Avenue. Because I have some questions for you about this. Grand Avenue, by the way, why is it not available on HBO? Is it
you
just
can Google it? It's all on. They sent it over to wherever it is. I don't know. A lot of their stuff they shoved it over to. You Google it and you can find it. I forget who the carrier is now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was trying to find it. The only thing I could find was on YouTube, which is
or YouTube.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Anyway,
YouTube. I'm sorry.
I would recommend. So we were talking on the phone last night, and I was telling you that, when I watched Grand Avenue, it was actually recommended to me by an Arapaho professor at the University of Montana, who has sort of a preternatural gift for finding films about Indigenous people that are really, really good, and he had recommended it, and so I watched it, and I was like, man, I have never seen something that felt this real, from the get-go, there's a sex scene in a car, but I was like, this is real.
I had to dispel the myth that Indians don't have sex.
but I was like, everything about that, from the second it started, I was like, this was written by somebody who knows Indian country. I knew it immediately because, if you're from Indian country, you can tell pretty quickly when somebody is either in, this is somebody who knows what they're talking about, or this is Kevin Costner, yes. and I just, but the thing I wanted to ask you about that I've been thinking about since I watched it is there's the thing about that I liked is that it's so honest about its characters and the situations and their behavior and the internal dynamics and but that's also the kind of writing that tends to do two things. It pisses people in the community off, which you already talked about a little bit, because they're like, well, you know, and the common phrase in my experience is like, why are you making us look bad in front of white people? And
Why
then,
are you hanging all our laundry out for
yeah,
everybody to
exactly.
see? I got that.
And the other one is, that's the Indian country that Hollywood doesn't know anything about. And so when I was telling you earlier, you know, the screenplay and the show that I produced and I put together that didn't get picked up, actually Grand Avenue is the only like I don't. It's so weird because HBO is like, we don't know anything, we don't understand this. But I'm like, but you guys made anyway. But but it was that kind of show. It was like that level of real, I guess. And they had the people we talked to in Hollywood, they were like, they could not figure out what it was because they wanted it to be something else. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about like that experience of like writing into a space where both sides basically are going to have
Attack you.
Yes.
Well, let me just start. Thanks for asking, Shirley. Let me just start with Stanford, because that's where those stories started, in the creative writing department. It was a different day. I know it's a good day now, I presume. But I remember I was writing those stories, and a professor said to me, "Who are these people? You're never going to publish this." And I think he had no idea that an Indian could be something other than someone in a loincloth on an Appaloosa horse chasing buffalo. And he said, I don't know, who are these people? You're never going to be able to publish these stories. You know, you're never going to be able to do this. And of course, at that time, it was the big news was the minimal story, Raymond Carver and all of that sort of thing. You know, those stories where, you know, Sally goes to Martha's Vineyard one summer and has an epiphany and decides to part her hair on the other side of her head. I didn't know from people like that, you know, but that's what everybody was supposedly writing about or doing. So anyway, I did what, you know, a lot of frightened writers do. I became a professor. And once I had a job, Sterling, and you know, I wrote the book and ended up getting a lucrative 2-book deal, and I was fortunate to have that moment in the sun. And of course, then Searchlight picked up one of the stories, and I adapted a screenplay for that. And then right when we were ready to go into production, Searchlight went financially bust. I mean, they've just come back. And as a consolation prize, I went to Sundance, and as the writer's lab there. And, you know, everybody told me I was going to be the next Francis Ford Coppola and all this kind of stuff. And I was a great writer, and they got me a fancy agent in Hollywood. And I went around shopping this script. And everybody was saying to me, you know, you write really well. Why don't you do something like this for Jodie Foster? And they were saying things like, this is really kind of too dark. I said, you mean skin color? What's, you know. So finally it ended up at HBO. And, you know, HBO still to this day is kind of the premier house. I mean, everybody wants to go there. And so you never question if they sit on it for 7 years, or you don't say, hurry up and give me an answer. Even agents won't do that. As long as they haven't said no, people are hopeful at HBO. So about 3 or 4 months went by, and finally I called Robert Redford, and I said, you know, Bob, if I'm going to be so famous and a great writer, I can't get this thing made. It's sitting in HBO. Why don't you say that you'll executive produce it and see what happens? He called, and remember in those days, if Clinton or the president called China, they'd put him on hold, but if Redford called, they'd put him through. So lo and behold, the next day, we had a contract at HBO. So Redford said he'd produce it, executive produce it. So, but then the other battle started about the reality. So, you know, Hollywood's amazing. You never know it by watching most movies, but it's all about, they question you about motivation. What motivates these characters? And they didn't understand what motivated these characters. You have a woman who is alcoholic, has 3 kids by 3 different guys, in and out of a job, trying to keep her kids together, love her kids. She's a complicated character. And I was getting questions from the producers like, well, she has a daughter that's running around the neighborhood causing trouble and having sex. Why doesn't she take her to counseling? And I'm going, You see, if a spaceship landed outside your window here and it said Mars in 5 minutes, would you just get on it and go? And they said, no. And I said, why not? Well, we don't know anything about it. And I said, that's what we know, how much we know about counseling. And then, they said, well, doesn't she want her to go to college or have piano lessons? And, she's trying to get, a hamburger on the table for food at night for her children. Anyway, and of course, then they wanted Cher because it had to market. Could you imagine her driving in that scene down from the reservation, singing Half-Breed? I don't think so. So I did what I always do, folks. I told you this earlier. I resorted to gang warfare. And I brought all the producers up to the reservation. And it's really fun watching people sometimes go up to the reservation because we go through the redwoods and they go, oh my God, any minute the Indian's going to jump out and they're going to be hugging Bambi or killing Bambi or something. And then, of course, you start getting to the junk cars and they say, what's this? And I said, we're almost home. So we get to my aunt's house and the lead character was a woman who, as we say, had in those days the traditional American Indian woman's summer uniform or dress, traditional dress, which is a muumuu, and rubber go-aheads and the pink and purple curlers in the hair and sunglasses. And the character wore sunglasses in the script with a missing lens. So we walk into the trailer, and my aunt's living in a trailer. And Indian people, whenever guests come, we have tons of food. Tons of food. It may be on paper plates, but we have tamales. We got all kinds of stuff, and pies up, to the ceiling. And, everybody's looking at all the food, and my Auntie Anita, a very powerful woman, stood up and kicked the producer in the butt. And he spun around, and she said to him, do you think we're just looking like this for nothing? And, of course, he's seeing these Pomo women with one eye coming out of the sunglasses, and he's thinking maybe it's a kind of Indian spiritual thing, So he said, no, but I'd be honored if you tell me. And she said, we're auditioning. God damn it, which one of us gets the part? And then she said, take a good look at us. We ain't Cher. Well, they still weren't kind of convinced. And, we started eating, and my aunt's eating her pie, and she's checking out these guys, these Hollywood guys, and she's eating her pie. And, of course, I said to her, Auntie, I thought you was on diet. She said, I am. I said, what about the pie? She said, I just eat it separate from my steak now. So, anyway, we're there, and my Auntie Anita finishes her pie, and she looks over at one of the guys, and she says, I'd like to take you down to the river and just lather you up. And that still didn't quite do it until they wanted to go for a walk on a reservation. I don't know why you want to go for a walk on a reservation. It's a damn ghetto in the woods. Dogs bite you. There's fleas. People, but they wanted to go, and my Auntie Anita said, I don't think that's a good idea. She said, us women up here, we don't get to town much. We sit in the bush and wait for strange men. They wanted to be escorted to the car, and all the way down, they decided that we didn't have to have Cher. But it was a constant struggle, a constant fight to make it real, to see what you saw, Sterling, from writing those stories as a writing fellow here at Stanford, from going in, translating it to screen. It was a constant struggle to show that we are people. We are people first. And yes, we've suffered a traumatic history, but we're neither wagon burners nor fallen nature gods. We're people. We're complicated people who've suffered a traumatic history, but we have humor and dignity, and against all odds, we try the best to take care of our kids and families. And I wanted to show that dignity despite all else. And so, that's what I think is so important. And I also have a chip on my shoulder because, nobody knew there were Indians in California until there were casinos, right? And so there were more Indians here than anywhere, and everything's always been about Indians east of the Rockies, not west of the Rockies. And we forget. And it's been a constant battle to have to educate folks and so forth. So it was a battle, but thank you. I mean, I got most of what I wanted, in the script, and I was able to adapt myself all 3 hours. And they gave me 1 hour first because I was an unproduced film writer. Never mind, I had written plays and stuff, but I was unproduced. And then they let me do 1 more hour, and then finally the 3rd hour. But it was a struggle and a fight. But the sad thing is, at the end of that, as you mentioned when we were talking, that came out on HBO, and then the next year in film, Sherman Alexie, Smoke Signals, and then there was a dearth, nothing for 25 years, nothing. And now we have Res Dogs that's come back, but that's 25 years later. And now what? As I was just talking to Tommy Orange, and he said, you know, there's these Indian renaissances, but why does there have to be a renaissance? In order for there to be a renaissance, something has to die. Why do we have to keep dying? So my tribe now with its resources is doing a lot to fight that. $4 million to Sundance for young people to do California Indian stories. So you just keep going and do whatever you can.
So, like, as chairman, like that means you're also dealing very directly with, with issues around enrollment, issues around, citizenship. Can we talk for a few minutes about that and why, in particular, why it is? I mean, it's particularly relevant at this moment in time, but it's always relevant. Like, why it is that it's dangerous to racialize us, and like what the problems are with using the blood quantum system and to determine citizenship and things like that. And that's something I have a feeling, just because you've been chairman for so long, that means that sort of stuff has been on your mind very directly for a long time.
Right, and it's a lot of the whole idea. Remember, as we were saying just a few moments ago, that the idea of blood quantum and all that sort of thing, that concept couldn't have even been understood in pre-contact times. Tribes couldn't have even thought that way. I mean, so a lot of that blood quantum thing came about, and of course and I'm jumping a lot of stuff in Sterling, came about with governments wanting to impose those rules on the tribes, on our tribal. They gave us sovereignty, but they told us how to be sovereign. And that is the tribes that were given sovereignty on small pieces out of the way land. But they wanted to impose blood quantum, that you could only be on the reservation if you were 3/4 or half American Indian, which, when you think about it, folks, in time, that's a way to just erase the tribe, because you're going to lose everybody, right? But they were thinking, one of the reasons I think they were thinking that way is because, remember, when they gave us sovereignty as independent nations, we had treaties with them that they had to hold up. The only way they could get rid of those treaties, besides outright breaking them, and they broke many of them, as we say, our reservation roads are like government treaties full of holes. But we never thought that way, and they imposed that on us. Now, some tribes were smart and have since, many tribes, amended their constitutions so that it's not about blood quantum, but linear relationships. But we cannot, bottom line, cannot think about American Indians as a race. We cannot. And the reason is because we are sovereign nations with treaty relations with the government. So if we choose to enroll an oak tree or a German shepherd into our tribe, we have the right to do that. So the danger of racializing us is just what Trump's Stephen Miller was doing at the doorsteps of the Supreme Court before Trump went out, which was to go to the Supreme Court and say the Indian people having sovereignty and the ability to have casinos and make money is unconstitutional because they're getting special treatment in this country based on race. And that was just tested this last year with the Indian Child Welfare Act, from the case from Texas, where it went to the Supreme Court. It's the one thing they did right, where they were saying, the Indian Child Welfare Act in the early 70s, it came about. Until that time, 25% of American Indian children were being adopted out with no say from the tribe. So we came along, we got that act done, and we said, before you adopt out an Indian person, you have to consult with the leadership and the tribe from which that person comes from, that child comes from. So they want to undo that and say, why do we have to go through these hoops? They're getting that because it's special racial treatment. No, we're sovereign nations with treaties. So you have to be thinking about that. You no sooner can do that than go to France and take a child from there and decide what to do. We are sovereign nations with government-to-government relations with the federal government. And we have to understand it that way and not think of us in terms of racialized groups. Yes, we have cultures, we have family histories and genealogies, but we are ultimately sovereign nations with treaty agreements with the federal government. We will decide who is in the tribe, how it will be, whether or not we want blood quantum, any of those things. So it has to really think there. There's real danger, so many, Indian people themselves, we start playing these games, disenrolling or saying this one doesn't have enough Indian blood, and of course, all of that sort of stuff. And of course, it really got heightened with casinos because there's money. And the fewer tribes, more per cap. I just say to my own people, to Indian people that are disenrolling people for greed and stuff, and I can say this, you ain't Indians. You're white trash with brown skin. Do not do that to your own people. We come from a time, and you'll remember this from your res, we might only have 10 beans in the pot, but if there were 20 people at the dinner table, we would find a way to share all those beans so all people could eat. We need to keep thinking that way. And whatever tribe you come from or whatever resources you have, you need to share and take care of others. That's the bottom line.
This is actually the problem with having an ignorant Supreme Court, because there are actually multiple. There have been numerous cases already, that have already proved again and again that Indian identity it's a political identity and not a racial identity. But when you don't have when none of your justices know that, because none of them know anything about Indian law, then you actually can bring things like that to the Supreme Court, and you may have a chance of getting that sort of thing to go through. But anyway, I'll stop there.
Well, and then I hate to be cynical, but given our history, I must be. So when you think of Killers of the Flower Moon, every time we've gotten something or we're taking care of ourselves, they want to find a way to get that.
That's right.
And, some of us, not all of us, but some of us have been successful in our various businesses, certainly your tribe in some ways and my tribe in some ways, and you take away sovereignty and it allows everybody else to come in and get it.
It's incredible.
Theft, it's the latest way.
Yeah. I'll stop here, but there's a whole, if you can get the right Native Studies prof in the right Native Studies class, they will walk you through all of the congressional statutes from the late 1800s, where there basically is just one statute after another, and every single one of them is just limiting tribes' ability to use their own resources, because white people on the edge of the reservation were pissed off that the tribal people were actually making a good go of logging or whatever it might be, oil, and so then you just have these laws, passed one after the other during that period, that eventually gets to the point where tribes, as an example, it's the craziest example that I remember learning, that tribes could not actually use their own timber unless it had fallen naturally and been burned. And so tribes just started lighting their own forest reserves on fire because they were like, this is the only way we're legally allowed to use our own timber reserve. Anyway, I'll stop there. I think we're going to open this up for a Q&A.
Yes, I think I can hear you, and I'll repeat the question, but there's a mic there. So, which of my works do I derive the most satisfaction from? Thank you for the question. That's like asking which one of your children do you like the best. And I'll say what my grandmother always used to say, I love you all differently. So, which is true in case of my books. I mean, certain books have certain meanings. The Mabel McKay book really was something for me because she was so instrumental in how I think about the world and who I am as a person, who I am today, and instilling guilt and all of that in me to become a tribal chairperson for 32 years. So that's a book that will always is emotional in many ways for me. It was also the hardest to write. She kept firing me when I was trying to write the book. I said, Mabel, there has to be a theme. She goes, I don't know about no theme. And I said, well, you have to tie up the story. She said, why would somebody want to do that? Tie up the stories. It was rough, but yes.
So please bear with me. Can you please clarify about the blood ratio? Does that concept still apply or it does not?
In some tribes it may, but in mine it certainly doesn't. Most tribes here in California, it does not. And let me just give you a little bit of history about how dangerous that is here in California. We're descendants of Coast Miwok people from Marin County and Southern Pomo people from Southern Sonoma County. And at the time of contact, there were about 20,000 of us altogether. Today, the 1,537 enrolled members, we all trace our ancestry back to one of 14 survivors, all of whom were women, all of whom were wives or concubines of the early Mexicans or Americans. We've been mixed, our survival is mixed. And so when the government created the reservations here in California, it created them for homeless Indians of certain areas. They didn't even identify tribes. They just said, for us, it was the homeless Indians of Bodega Bay, Tamales Bay, Sebastopol, and the vicinities thereof. So anybody who was on an Indian census became a designee for that de facto tribe that was created as a sovereign nation. You see, so again, in that case, if you wanted to go by blood quantum or even half or something like that, it becomes problematic. On the records, my grandmother is listed as a full-blood Indian, but she was not. She was, maybe 3/4 or 2/3 because there was Spanish or Mexican and even some Russian from Fort Ross in there. All right, so it was mixed, and that would make me less than a quarter or something like that. So, and again, it isn't. And the thing you have to be careful of is remember, blood or race never presupposes point of view. I would be mean here, and I'll say Clarence Thomas, case in point. But I think that you have to understand those women, despite having children who are all mixed blood, right? They kept the language and the culture alive, that it got continued passed down to us so that we speak the language today. How many children that are here from Europe, second or third generation or fourth or fifth generations, speak the French or the German or whatever it was that they came over with? We kept it, despite all of this. And those women, every time I get tired, I think about what those incredible women went through so that I could be here. The humiliation, the rape, the compromise. The first piece of legislation that was passed in the state of California was called the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, and it legalized Indian slavery here. That was in 1850. It was not repealed until 1868, 3 years after the end of the Civil War. And indentured servitude continued here until the 1930s, where they would get Indians drunk, put them in jail, and then sell their labor on Saturday morning. So, and of course, throughout the country, we weren't citizens until 1924. So these small tribes, these women had no recourse in the courts. And so to disqualify me or my family because we weren't, let's say, full-bloods, after what those women did to keep the culture and our lives alive, to me is an ultimate disrespect to them, the power of our women.
Thank you so much for your passion and your realness. I just have a little question. I was talking to my landlord who lives in Australia, and as I understand it, there's a lot of acknowledgement all the time around Indigenous people there, and although Australia obviously has loads of ground to make up, things seem to be more in the conscious collective mind around advocacy and changing things and respect and dignity. And I'm a foreigner, but I've been educated in this country and always floored by the total lack of mention regarding Indigenous matters. And I'm wondering why you think the United States so struggles to acknowledge this truth in comparison to other colonized countries.
That's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking it. And I'll tell you what I think, as if I haven't all along. But the American Indian is the prick in the American conscience. Americans can say slavery was wrong, we got rid of it, never mind the legacy of slavery. Or they can say, well, immigrants choose to come here, never mind the circumstances under which immigrants have chosen to come here. But what stories are you going to tell about genocide and theft? So we get reduced to a couple stereotypes. We're wagon burners when we're bad and fight back, or we're loved when we're fallen nature gods, when we're powerless and we're doing art in museums and writing stories and all of that sort of thing. In my own life, when I was writing the Grand Avenue and the books and the movies, I was Sonoma County's and Northern California's native son. When I came back with a casino, whenever it's a question of power or territory, we're wagon burners, I suddenly became a wagon burner with death threats and all that kind of thing. So again, our stories are reduced to Hollywood stereotypes of wagon burners or Hollywood stereotypes of the fallen nature god. And I think that, again, Americans it's very hard. And this is a lesson to learn from, not to punish, not to feel guilty. It's a lesson to learn from what happens when people are blinded to others, or think that they know what's best for others without talking. So it's a lesson. But nonetheless, it's a very difficult story for people, especially people feeling entitled or empowered, to think that they are on stolen land. As a regent, I went out to talk to the protesters at a regents meeting at Merced, and they were all screaming at me because I was a regent, right? And so I just said, hold up, everybody, you don't know who I am. And I said, we just got to start with a certain principle. And I said, yeah, they were screaming at me. And I said, wait a minute, I'm an American Indian, a California Indian, and just so that we might talk, let's start with the fact that all of you here are standing on occupied land. They became very quiet. But we forget that. We forget that. And that's not about being punished or anything, but it's about as I've taught for years, what can we learn from this? How can we be better? What happens when instead of seeing controlled burning as a way of taking care of the landscape, you thought the Indians were burning the land so that your cattle and horses couldn't eat? Just think if we had asked a question. We wouldn't be in the predicament with fires we are today. So there's things we could have learned if we just talked to one another. But again, I think one of the problems is with the American Indian story is it makes people feel guilty. It makes them question perhaps entitlement. And, as students would say, well, I didn't do it. Well, I know you didn't do it. But let's learn from this story. And let's see what we can do, because we're all here now, especially with climate change. The sun is not going to discriminate. The environment is going to be the great equalizer. It's as good as death. It gets everybody. So we have to remember that and think what we can learn. When do I find time to write with a degree of contention? Sterling and I were talking about this, and writers were great procrastinators. It is difficult to face that blank page. I remember a writer here, a woman I respected, Harriet Dewar, years ago, likened it to being the Acapulco diver. Every morning you face that blank page the way a diver faces those rocks, right? And you kind of got to go, well, you got to dive. So you procrastinate, and gosh, when you're a tribal chairperson and doing politics, you have so many reasons to procrastinate. And suddenly it's 6 o'clock at night and you had started at 9 in the morning to write, and there's nobody calling on the phone anymore, and you think, oh my God, I haven't written anything and it's already dinner time. I've got to start writing. So that's kind of how it happens. Yeah.
Can you say more about the relationship between culture and the preservation of language? Since you were mentioning your ancestor who took great pains to preserve the language, and I'm just wondering about the ongoing resonance of that work.
Again, thanks for asking. So there's been a renaissance of languages, and there was languages that continued. But the Pomo language, there's still a few of us elders and others that speak it. Coast Miwok, the last fluent speaker, had passed away in 1978. And that woman and my great-great-grandfather were informants for linguistics. So the young people are learning off the tapes, and they're now having dialogue and speaking in the language. And it's so important to think in terms of the language. Pomo language, for instance, just to give you an idea, it's an action-oriented language where the verb is the main feature of the language. So it's an action-oriented. And when you translate it to English, English is a subject-oriented language. The subject is the focus, not the action. So when you translate or even speak, it's like two different kinds of ideas or almost ways of thinking, right? And so learning the indigenous language is like, again, placing yourself back to some extent in a different way of thinking. And I never want to say that just because topical features of a language, make you think in a certain way, but it does get you familiar with the difference and appreciate structurally how different the language is, for instance. And as I like to say to my young people, speak the language. The trees and the animals really want to hear it, because Spanish and English, they're still trying to figure that out. It's pretty recent. So I think the animals love that.
Greg.
Yes.
I listened to you and Obi with your Place podcast, and you said something about the combination of dream and science. And I'd love for you to speak to that a little bit, because that was very, very powerful.
I think that going forward, I think that the answer isn't just science. Remember, science, anybody can learn what kind of soil and what kind of thing to do to plant something, or what you have to do to maintain the trees. But until you start to have, let's say, a poet's sensibility or a dreamer's sensibility of the tree, where you feel connected and responsible to it, just cutting branches after a while is going to get boring. Once you know that the tree is inseparable from you and you're responsible for it, and some of the ways to see that is through dream, through poetry, through art, through story. That combined with science is, I think, what we're going to need going forward. Science can teach us certain things. As we often say, a lot of the stuff we already knew. I mean, science is now coming out with the fact that redwood trees and oak trees, their roots are communicating to one another. Well, duh, they're alive, But they're finding certain kinds of things that we've known for a long time. Again, there was a prophecy in our roundhouse in the late 50s where Mrs. Parrish, a prophet, my grandmother's cousin, said there's going to be a day coming when the white people are going to realize they did things wrong, and they're going to be coming to us to get answers about how to live, because things are going to go very wrong. And she said, you young people are leaving everything we're teaching like clothes, just throwing them on the ground. Pick them up, because they're going to be useful. So I think, again, it's going to be a combination of things that's going to get us through. Not one thing or the other, but all of us working and respecting various ways of doing things.
Greg, I would first like to thank you for like everything you shared tonight and for reading the book. I might like have a question that's like more related to the book itself. So I wonder, what was your like? Would you mind sharing some background over why you chose to tell these stories in the form of a conversation instead of just plain storytelling?
Again, thank you. Yeah, I did want to talk a lot about the book tonight. That's why I'm here. So thank you for the question. I wanted, again, the feel of the ancient tradition, but I also wanted the feel like of being at home where you heard people talking back and forth and telling stories. So it's kitchen type stuff where you sit around. I miss the elders that have passed on because we used to sit around, drink coffee, and tell stories all night. Somebody would ask a question and then said, oh yeah, that's when somebody did this, and they would tell the story about that. And so I wanted it to feel conversational. And that way, invoke the oral tradition. And it is, I'm thinking a lot about the oral tradition, even though the stories are very, as you've suggested, Sterling, tightly crafted. I didn't want to lose that sense of the spontaneity and the oral kind of thing where somebody says, well, you said this, but what about this? And then, well, let me tell you a story about that. As my, I can remember the nights, and I miss them so much up on the res at home, where, we'd be talking all night and my aunt would go, oh, that one, let me tell you about her, so they would go on. Or they'd say, oh, this guy did this and he broke the rule and he tried to poison this woman and do this and this came back. Or, she was doing this with her love medicine or whatever. And I would hear these stories. And so I didn't want to lose that oral sensibility. And that's, I guess, one of the best ways I can answer that question about why I wanted the stories to feel, the book to feel conversational. It takes place in a day where two women, call them crows, call them humans, call them both, are just talking back and forth. This reminds me of that. Tell me about this. Why did this happen? How do, isn't that how we kind of learned everything? Asking questions? Yeah, thank you for asking.
Thank you, Greg and Sterling.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. Thank you for reading. We've got to keep reading. As I always used to say when I was teaching, I'd leave my classes and always say to my students, just remember, it's not a sin to think. And we really need it today and to read. Anyway, thank you for caring and coming out tonight. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.